Okay, so in this lecture we're looking at pure economic loss. So in Spartan Steel, it was basically said that you cannot claim for pure economic loss. You can claim for any consequential loss that comes as a result of that, but not pure economic loss itself. This was also supported in Hedley, Byrne and Heller. However, it was said that there is an exception if there is a special relationship between the defendant and the claimant. And this led to the question of where does this duty of care arise? So this is a list of factors that have to be considered. I think with this topic, the best thing to do is just learn the cases and see if any questions that you have, so if it's a problem question, if there are similar factors arising and using those cases to back it up. I think an essay question would probably be talking about how it's quite unclear where these duties arise, if it should be put into statutory form. Just, I think this is more of a memory topic. So the first factor is whether the defendant assumed responsibility. So in Smith and Bush, the bank assumed responsibility for valuation. This is something that they undertook, and it's something that the claimant relied on, and thus they were liable for the damage and loss suffered. We then have to look at whether it was reasonable or not for the claimant to rely on this. And for this you need two things. First of all, that reliance actually takes place. This was established in Howard Marine, and then looking at Henderson, it shows that reliance has to be in relation to the provision of services from which the economic loss comes from. We then look to the purpose of the defendant's statement. So going back to Smith and Bush, that bank's valuation was relied on. It was made for the purpose of that reliance, and thus they should be liable for it. The same applies in James McNaughton. So these accounts produced were to be relied on when the bidder took over, and so liability can arise where this goes wrong and they suffer loss from this. So we then look at the context which the statement has been made in. So in Hedley Byrne, it was basically said that this liability is only ever going to come if statements are made in a business context. However, if we look at Chaudhry, it was a social context, however they went over and beyond what was required of them, and thus they assumed, it's like the assumption of responsibility, and thus they were liable for any loss suffered. We can also look at the relationship between the parties. So in Spring and Guardian Assurance, an employer was writing references for an ex-employee, and they were written in such a way that they cast doubt on how the employee had left the company. It was written in such a way that no one would hire them, and thus the ex-employee could claim for this loss because they weren't being hired, they weren't having an income, and this was as a result of the defendant's actions. It's also important if the defendant claims to be an expert. So in Henderson, if a defendant's voluntarily going to assume responsibility for economic interests where they have skill or expertise that is relied on, a duty of care will arise. And this was clear in Esso Petroleum, where they gave figures on how much profit would be made if this was placed here, and the claimant relied on that, and they ended up not generating that profit. And it was clear here that Esso had special knowledge and this was relied on, and thus they could claim here for that pure economic loss. We then look at the size of any class which the claimant belonged to. Here you can use acquire and dicument. I think it's the same idea of, is it fair, just and reasonable to impose liability here? So if it's a large group of people, they're probably less likely to find liability because of the amount of claims that would come in. They don't want floodgates. And we can also look at practical justice. I think this was quite interesting. In White and Jones, a solicitor didn't draft a will appropriately, and thus the claimant was allowed to claim for any benefit which they had lost as a result of the defendant's failure. And lastly, you can also look at the defendant's state of knowledge, what they knew when the statement was made, how much they should have known or ought to have known, etc.